By the start of 1963, Elvis Presley was one of the most recognized names on the planet. He had already spent years at the top of the music world, and by this point, his career had moved well beyond records and radio. He was making movies, selling out shows, and his face was known in countries where people had never even heard his music played live. But behind that level of fame, there was a man who was working constantly and had very little control over the direction of his own career. Elvis had started recording for Sun Records in Memphis back in 1954. Within 2 years, he had signed with RCA and released songs that changed popular music entirely. By 1956, he was on national television, appearing on The Ed Sullivan Show, and the reaction from audiences was unlike anything seen before. Young people responded to him in a way that was completely new. His music combined rhythm and blues, country and gospel in a style that felt fresh and different. Radio stations played his songs around the clock. Record stores could not keep his albums in stock. Then came Hollywood. Elvis made his first film, Love Me Tender, in 1956. It was a modest production, but the box office numbers were strong simply because of who he was. Studios took notice. Over the next several years, Elvis made one film after another. Some were better than others, but they all performed well commercially. By 1963, he had made more than a dozen movies and had become one of the most bankable stars in Hollywood, not just in music. The problem was that Elvis wanted more from his film career than what he was getting. He had hoped to take on serious dramatic roles. Early on, there were signs that he could do it. His performance in King Creole in 1958 received genuine praise from critics. Some people in the industry believed he had real acting ability if given the right material. But his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, kept steering him toward lighter, musical films that were safe, commercially reliable, and easy to produce. Elvis went along with it, even when he was not happy about it. He was under contract, and the decisions were largely out of his hands. By early 1963, he was preparing to film Fun in Acapulco, one of several projects lined up for that year. His schedule was full. His life was structured almost entirely around work. He had a close group of friends around him, the people who would later become known as the Memphis Mafia, and they traveled with him, kept him company, and helped manage his daily life. But for all the people surrounding him, Elvis was in many ways isolated. Fame at that level created distance, and the constant work left little room for anything else. Ann-Margret was in a very different place in her life, but her career path had some striking similarities. She was born in Sweden in 1941 and moved to the United States as a child. She grew up in Illinois and later studied at Northwestern University before leaving to pursue performing full-time. She could sing, dance, and act, and she worked hard to develop all three. Her energy on stage was natural and powerful, and people noticed it quickly. Her breakthrough came in 1961 when she appeared in the film Pocketful of Miracles. The following year, she starred in Bye Bye Birdie, which was based on the Broadway musical. The film did well and introduced her to a much wider audience. She was funny, talented, and had a presence on screen that was hard to ignore. Critics were kind to her, and audiences responded warmly. Almost overnight, she went from being a promising newcomer to someone Hollywood was paying close attention to. What made Ann-Margret stand out was not just her talent, but her personality. She wasn't trying to copy anyone or fit into a mold that already existed. She had her own style and her own energy. She loved performing the way some people love breathing. It wasn't something she did for attention. It was simply who she was. Offstage, people who worked with her described her as genuine, down to earth, and easy to be around. By early 1963, both Elvis and Ann-Margret were at important points in their careers. Elvis was established, but looking for something more meaningful in his work. Ann-Margret was rising fast and proving herself in a competitive industry. Neither of them knew yet that they were about to be cast in the same film. Neither of them could have predicted what would happen once they were introduced. But in a few weeks, their paths would cross, and for both of them, nothing would be quite the same after that. The meeting between Elvis Presley and Ann-Margret did not happen by accident. It was the result of a straightforward business decision made by the people putting together the film Viva Las Vegas. The studio needed two leads who could carry a musical film, who had chemistry on screen, and who would bring audiences into theaters. Elvis was already attached to the project. The search was on for the right actress to play opposite him. When Ann-Margret's name came up, it did not take long for the people involved to agree that she was the right choice. Ann-Margret had just finished Bye Bye Birdie, and her stock in Hollywood was rising quickly. She could sing and dance at a professional level, which was not something every actress in that era could offer. For a film like Viva Las Vegas, that combination mattered. The producers needed someone who could hold her own in musical numbers alongside Elvis, not just stand next to him and look good. Ann-Margret fit that requirement better than almost anyone else they could have considered. Once the casting decision was made, the two were brought together for the first time. The meeting took place in a professional setting, the kind of introduction that happens regularly in the film industry when two leads are paired for a project. There was nothing unusual about the arrangement itself. Studios did this all the time. Two actors meet, they talk, they get a sense of whether they can work together, and then production moves forward. That was how it was supposed to go. What nobody expected was how quickly the two of them connected. People who were present at that first meeting later said there was an ease between Elvis and Ann-Margret that was noticeable right away. They were not awkward around each other. There was no period of warming up or figuring out how to communicate. They simply talked, and it felt natural from the start. Part of that had to do with who they both were as people. Elvis, despite his enormous fame, was known among people who actually spent time with him as someone who was easy to talk to in a personal setting. He was warm, he had a good sense of humor, and he paid attention when someone was speaking to him. He did not perform in private the way he did on stage. Around people he was comfortable with, he was relaxed and straightforward. Ann-Margret had a similar quality. She was not trying to impress anyone or manage how she came across. She was simply herself, and that made conversation easy. What helped the connection along was that they quickly discovered how much they had in common. This was not something either of them had to search for. It came up naturally as they talked. Music was the most obvious thing. Both of them had built their careers around performing, and both of them took it seriously, not as a job, but as something they genuinely loved. They talked about the kind of music they grew up with, the performers they admired, and what it felt like to be on stage in front of a crowd. Those were not topics either of them had to work to discuss. It was simply where the conversation went. The other thing that came up early was motorcycles. Elvis had been riding for years. It was one of the few activities that gave him a sense of freedom and privacy in a life that was almost entirely public. He could get on a motorcycle, ride, and for a short time feel like an ordinary person. Ann-Margret felt the same way about riding. She had her own motorcycle and genuinely enjoyed it. This was not something she mentioned to seem interesting or to find common ground with Elvis. It was true, and when it came up, it gave the two of them something real to talk about outside of work. By the time that first meeting ended, something had shifted. It was not dramatic or obvious from the outside, but the people who were present noticed that Elvis and Ann-Margret had moved past the usual professional introduction. They were talking like two people who already knew each other, not like two actors being introduced before a film shoot. Neither of them made a big deal of it at the time. There was still work to be done before filming started, and both of them had full schedules. But the introduction had gone beyond what anyone had planned for it to be. Something personal had begun, quietly and without any announcement, in what was supposed to be a routine meeting between two professionals getting ready to make a movie together. When two people meet and feel comfortable around each other almost immediately, there is usually a reason for it. In the case of Elvis Presley and Ann-Margret, the reason was not hard to find. They were, in many important ways, remarkably similar people. Not in terms of background or where they came from, but in terms of what they cared about, how they approached their work, and what made them feel most alive. Those similarities became clear quickly, and they formed the foundation of everything that developed between them. The most obvious thing they shared was music. Both of them had built their entire lives around it. For Elvis, music was not something he had chosen as a career path in any calculated way. It was simply what he did from the time he was very young. He grew up in Tupelo, Mississippi, in a household where gospel music was a constant presence. He absorbed it naturally, along with the rhythm and blues he heard in the neighborhoods around him and the country music that came through on the radio. By the time he walked into Sun Records as a teenager, music was already the most important thing in his life. It never stopped being that, even as the fame and the business side of things grew complicated around it. Ann-Margret had a similar relationship with performing. She had not grown up planning to be a star, she had grown up loving music and movement, and that love had guided every decision she made as a young person. She sang, she danced, she threw herself into performing with a kind of energy that was not manufactured. People who watched her work consistently said the same thing about her. She was not putting on a show for the audience. She was doing something that came from inside her, and the audience simply got to witness it. That quality was real, and Elvis recognized it immediately because he had the same quality himself. Beyond the love of music, they also shared a similar approach to performing. Both of them were physical performers. Elvis moved on stage in a way that was entirely his own, something that had shocked audiences when he first appeared on television and had never stopped being a defining part of who he was. Ann-Margret had the same instinct. She did not stand still and deliver a song. She moved, she used her whole body, and she brought an energy to a performance that filled whatever space she was in. When the two of them rehearsed together for Viva Las Vegas, the people watching said it was immediately clear that they matched each other in a way that was rare. They pushed each other, fed off each other's energy, and made each other better without either of them having to try. The motorcycles were another real connection. This might seem like a small detail, but for Elvis it was not small at all. Riding was one of the only things in his life that gave him genuine privacy and a feeling of freedom. He could not walk down a street without being recognized. He could not go to a restaurant or a movie theater without creating a scene. But on a motorcycle, moving fast, he was just a person on a bike. Nobody could stop him or surround him or ask for a photograph. It was his escape, and he took it seriously. When he found out that Ann-Margret felt the same way about writing, that it was not just something she did occasionally, but something she genuinely loved, it meant something to him. It was a point of real connection, not a surface-level coincidence. They also shared a similar sense of humor. People who spent time around both of them during this period said they made each other laugh easily and often. Neither of them was performing when they were together in private. They were relaxed, playful, and straightforward with each other. That kind of ease is not something you can manufacture between two people. Either it is there or it is not. And between Ann-Margret and Elvis, it was clearly there from the beginning. There was also something deeper that connected them, something harder to put into simple terms. Both of them understood what it meant to carry a public image that did not always match who they actually were in private. Elvis was seen by the world as this enormous, life-than-large figure, but the people close to him knew a quieter, more thoughtful person underneath. Ann-Margret had her own version of that gap between public perception and private reality. They recognized that in each other without having to explain it, and that recognition created a level of comfort and trust that took most people much longer to build. The weeks before Viva Las Vegas officially began production were not filled with rehearsals and script readings alone. Elvis and Ann-Margret had found something in each other during their first meeting that neither of them had expected, and as the days passed, they began spending time together outside of any professional obligation. It was gradual at first, the way these things usually are. A conversation that ran longer than planned, an invitation to ride motorcycles, an evening that extended past what either of them had originally intended. Slowly, the time they spent together stopped being about the film and started being about each other. Elvis was living in a rented home in Los Angeles during this period, as he often did when he was working on a film. He had his usual group of friends around him, the people who traveled with him and kept his daily life running. But with Ann-Margret, he found himself wanting time that was quieter and more personal. She was not part of that larger group dynamic, and that separation was important. Around her, Elvis could have a conversation that felt private, which was something he did not often get to experience. Motorcycle rides became one of the main ways they spent time together. Los Angeles in the early 1960s had open roads that were easy to get lost on, and that was exactly what both of them wanted. They would ride together through the hills and along routes that took them away from the busy parts of the city.
For Elvis, these rides were a continuation of something he already valued deeply, that feeling of movement and open space that gave him a break from the controlled environment his fame required. Sharing that experience with someone who genuinely loved it as much as he did made it more meaningful. Ann-Margret was not along for the ride because Elvis enjoyed it. She was there because she wanted to be, and he could tell the difference. During this time, Elvis also had Ann-Margret over to the house where he was staying. These were not large gatherings or parties. They were quiet evenings where the two of them could talk without an audience. People close to Elvis during this period later recalled that he was different when Ann-Margret was around. More relaxed, more present, more like himself in an unguarded way. That observation came from multiple people independently, which gives it weight. Something about her company brought out a side of Elvis that his usual environment did not always allow. They talked about everything during this time. Music came up constantly, not in a professional way, but in the way two people talk about something they genuinely love. They shared opinions about performers they admired, songs that had meant something to them, and what it felt like to be on stage when a performance was going exactly right. These were not conversations Elvis could have with just anyone. Most people around him were employees or fans, and both of those relationships came with limits. Ann-Margret was neither. She was a peer, someone who understood the work from the inside because she did it herself. There was also a simplicity to their time together that Elvis appreciated. Ann-Margret did not want anything from him beyond his company. She was not impressed by his fame in a way that changed how she behaved around him. She treated him like a person, which sounds like it should be a basic thing, but was actually quite rare in his daily life. Almost everyone Elvis encountered related to him through the filter of who he was publicly. Ann-Margret related to him directly, and that made a genuine difference in how comfortable he felt around her. For Ann-Margret, the time before filming was equally significant. She later spoke about this period in interviews with a clarity that made it obvious it had stayed with her. She described Elvis as someone who was warm and attentive, someone who listened when she talked and remembered details from earlier conversations. She was not describing a performance he was putting on for her benefit. She was describing how he actually was, and it matched what others who knew him personally had said about him throughout his life. By the time the production schedule for Viva Las Vegas was set and filming was ready to begin, Elvis and Ann-Margret were no longer simply two actors preparing to work together. Something real had developed between them during those weeks, built out of motorcycle rides, quiet evenings, honest conversations, and the kind of ease that comes when two people recognize something familiar in each other. Whatever was going to happen next, the foundation had already been laid before a single camera rolled.
While Elvis and Ann-Margret were spending time in Los Angeles in the weeks before filming began, there was a reality back in Memphis that did not go away simply because Elvis was far from home. Priscilla Bulio was living at Graceland. She had been part of Elvis's life for several years by this point, and the arrangement that had brought her to Memphis was not a casual one. It had involved serious conversations, formal promises, and the direct involvement of her family. That background was not something Elvis could set aside easily, and it shaped the context around everything that was developing between him and Ann-Margret. Priscilla and Elvis had met in 1959 when Elvis was stationed in West Germany during his time in the United States Army. She was 14 years old at this time, and he was 24. Her father was an officer in the Air Force, and when Elvis asked permission to spend time with Priscilla, her parents were understandably cautious. Elvis was persuasive, and over time he built enough trust with her family that the relationship was allowed to continue. When his military service ended and he returned to the United States in 1960, the two stayed in contact. The situation became more serious in 1962 when Elvis asked Priscilla's parents if she could come to the United States to finish her schooling and live at Graceland. This was not a small request. Her father agreed only after Elvis made clear commitments about her well-being, her education, and the nature of the arrangement. Priscilla moved to Memphis, enrolled in a local Catholic school, and began living at Graceland under the watch of Elvis's father, Vernon, and his wife. It was a formal arrangement built on specific promises, and those promises carried real weight. By early 1963, when Elvis was in Los Angeles preparing for Viva Las Vegas, Priscilla was at Graceland finishing her education.
She knew that Elvis's work took him away for long periods, and that his life in Hollywood involved a social world she was not part of. Elvis maintained contact with her during his time away, and by most accounts, she trusted him. She was young, she was far from her own family, and she had built her daily life around the expectation that her future was connected to his. Elvis genuinely cared about Priscilla. That is not in question. People who knew him well during this period consistently said that his feelings for her were real and that he took his responsibility toward her seriously. But caring about someone and being fully committed to them in every sense are not always the same thing, and Elvis's life during this period reflected that complexity. He was a young man in his late 20s, working in an environment filled with attractive and talented people, living far from home for months at a time. The structure that might have kept those circumstances more manageable simply was not in place. There was also the matter of how Elvis handled emotional compartmentalization. People close to him over the years observed that he had a capacity to keep different parts of his life separate from each other in his own mind. This was not unique to him, and it was not something he talked about openly, but it meant that what was happening in Los Angeles and what was waiting for him in Memphis could exist in parallel without him forcing a direct confrontation between the two. That ability to separate things internally allowed him to be fully present in each situation without immediately resolving the tension between them. Ann-Margret was aware that Elvis had someone in his life. It was not a secret, and she was not naive about the situation. She was a grown woman, building her own career and living her own life. She did not answer the time they spent together before filming with a plan or an agenda. What developed between them was genuine, and she responded to it honestly. But she also understood that the situation had complications that neither of them had created and neither of them could simply eliminate. None of this played out in dramatic confrontations or public statements during this period. There were no arguments, no ultimatums, and no announcements. The situation simply existed in the background, real and unresolved, while Elvis and Ann-Margret continued spending time together and preparing for the film. It was the kind of complicated human situation that does not have a clean explanation or a simple verdict. Two things were true at the same time. Elvis cared about Priscilla and had made real commitments to her, and something equally real was developing between him and Ann-Margret. That tension would not stay in the background forever, but for now, filming was about to begin. When Elvis and Ann-Margret arrived on the set of Viva Las Vegas, they were not arriving as two strangers meeting for the first time. The weeks before filming had already changed things between them, and the people who worked on the production noticed it almost immediately. You cannot spend time around two people who have developed a genuine connection and not sense it. It shows in small ways, in how they look at each other, how they talk, how comfortable they are in each other's space. On the set of Viva Las Vegas, those signs were visible to anyone paying attention, and plenty of people were. The director of the film was George Sidney, an experienced Hollywood professional who had worked with major stars throughout his career. He recognized quickly that what he had between his two leads was something beyond standard on-screen chemistry. Elvis and Ann-Margret were not performing warmth toward each other for the camera. They brought something into the work that was already there before filming started, and Sidney was smart enough to let it come through rather than try to manage it. The result was visible in the footage. Their scenes together had an energy that felt unscripted, even when every word and movement had been planned in advance. The crew members who worked on the film daily were perhaps the most direct observers of what was happening. Camera operators, sound technicians, choreographers, and assistants all spent long hours on set watching Elvis and Ann-Margret interact between takes as much as during them. What they consistently described later was a natural ease between the two that stood out. They were relaxed around each other in a way that actors who are simply professional colleagues rarely are. They laughed at things only they understood. They finished each other's thoughts in conversation. They moved through the same physical space with a comfort that takes most people much longer to develop. The choreography sessions for the film's musical numbers gave people perhaps the clearest view of what was happening. Viva Las Vegas required Elvis and Ann-Margret to perform together in several elaborate sequences, and the rehearsal process meant spending hours working through movements, timing, and physical coordination. Choreographers who worked on those sessions noted that the two of them picked up on each other's rhythms quickly and naturally. There was no stiffness, no awkwardness, no need for the extended rehearsal time that often comes when two performers are still figuring out how to share a stage. They moved together as though they had been doing it for years. People who were part of Elvis's inner circle during the filming period also observed changes in him that they connected to Ann-Margret's presence. Members of the group around Elvis noted that he seemed more energized on this project than he had been on some of his recent films. He was engaged in a way that went beyond just showing up and doing the work. He was enjoying himself, and the reason for that was not hard to identify. Ann-Margret brought something in him on set that translated directly into the quality of his performance. The people closest to him could see it clearly. Ann-Margret's own team noticed things as well. Her colleagues and the professionals around her observed that she was fully invested in this project in a way that went beyond the professional opportunity it represented. She prepared carefully, she was present and focused during filming, and she brought a level of energy to her scenes with Elvis that people around her recognized as something personal as well as professional. She was not simply doing her job well, she was doing it with a kind of investment that came from somewhere deeper. There were also people on the production who noticed the situation with a more practical eye. Hollywood in the early 1960s was a professional environment, but it was also a social one, and people talked. Word moved around the film set quickly. The nature of what was developing between the two leads was not a formal announcement, but it was not a carefully kept secret either. People drew their own conclusions from what they observed, and most of those conclusions pointed in the same direction. The connection between Elvis and Ann-Margret was real. It was visible, and it was affecting the work in ways that showed up on screen. What all of these observers shared was a consistent picture. Two talented people had come into a project already connected to each other in a way that went beyond professional preparation. The set of Viva Las Vegas became the place where what had started in private, on motorcycle rides and quiet evenings before filming began, became visible to the wider world around them. Everyone could see it. Most people simply watched and said nothing, because what was happening in front of them was producing something genuinely compelling on screen.
One of the most reliable ways to understand what something meant to a person is to listen to what they said about it. Not in the moment, when emotions are high and words can be careless, but later, when there has been time to reflect and the pressure of the situation has passed. Both Elvis Presley and Ann-Margret spoke about each other over the years in ways that were honest, considered, and consistent. Their words, taken together, give a clear picture of what the connection between them actually meant, and why it stayed with both of them long after Viva Las Vegas was finished and their lives had moved in separate directions. Ann-Margret was perhaps the more openly expressive of the two when it came to talking about Elvis. She wrote about him in her autobiography, which was published in 1994, and what she said there was detailed and genuine. She did not write about Elvis the way someone writes about a famous person they once worked with. She wrote about him the way someone writes about a person who genuinely changed something in their life. She described their connection as something she had not expected and had not been looking for. It arrived without announcement and turned out to be one of the most significant relationships of her life. She described Elvis as someone who made her feel understood in a way that was rare. She said he paid attention to her in a way that felt real, not performed. He noticed things about her that most people missed, and he remembered details from conversations they had shared. For someone living a public life where most interactions are surface level, that kind of genuine attention meant a great deal. She was not describing a man who was trying to impress her. She was describing a man who was simply interested in who she was, and that interest felt authentic because it came without any obvious motive behind it. Ann-Margret also spoke about the way their shared love of music created a bond between them that went deeper than conversation alone. She said that when they performed together, something happened that she could not fully explain in practical terms. They matched each other in a way that felt effortless, and that effortlessness on stage reflected something real that existed between them off stage as well. For two people whose entire lives were built around performance, finding someone who understood that world from the inside and could meet you there fully was not a small thing. Elvis was less publicly expressive about personal matters as a general rule. He did not give many interviews about his private life, and when he did, he tended to be careful about what he said.
but he spoke about Ann-Margret in terms that were clearly warmer than the way he talked about professional colleagues. People who were close to him during and after the filming of Viva Las Vegas said that he spoke about her with a respect and fondness that was genuine and consistent. He did not talk about her in the way men sometimes talk about women they have been involved with, reducing the experience to something casual or self-congratulatory. He spoke of her as someone he admired deeply, both as a performer and as a person. Those who knew Elvis well said he described Ann-Margret as someone who was real with him, in a way that not many people were. She did not treat him like Elvis Presley the icon. She treated him like Elvis the person, and that distinction mattered enormously to him. He had spent years surrounded by people whose relationship to him was defined by his fame, whether they were fans, employees, or professionals who needed something from him. Ann-Margret simply liked him, and he felt that clearly. Elvis also expressed admiration for her as a performer in terms that were specific and informed. He did not offer vague compliments. He spoke about what she actually did on stage and on screen, with the kind of detail that comes from someone who had watched closely and thought carefully about what they were seeing. He recognized her talent as something genuine and serious, not just something that served the film they were making together. That recognition was meaningful to Ann-Margret, who understood the difference between praise offered out of politeness and praise that came from real observation. What both of them said, across different interviews and different years, pointed toward the same conclusion. What happened between them before and during Viva Las Vegas was not a brief distraction or a passing moment of attraction between two young people working closely together. It was a real connection between two people who recognized something important in each other and held on to that recognition long after the circumstances that created it had changed. Their own words, honest and consistent across decades, make that clear without any need for outside interpretation.
Some connections between people are defined entirely by the circumstances that created them. When the circumstances change, the connection fades, and eventually it disappears. What happened between Elvis Presley and Ann-Margret was not that kind of connection. What began in the weeks before Viva Las Vegas filming started and deepened during the production itself turned into something that neither time nor distance nor the separate directions their lives took was able to erase. The bond they formed in 1963 lasted until the day Elvis died, and for Ann-Margret it has never fully gone away even decades after that. When filming on Viva Las Vegas wrapped up, both Elvis and Ann-Margret returned to their separate lives. Elvis went back to Graceland, back to Priscilla, and back to the steady stream of film projects and recording sessions that filled his schedule year after year. Ann-Margret continued building her own career, which went from strength to strength throughout the 1960s and beyond. She took on more challenging roles, expanded her work in television and live performance, and established herself as one of the most versatile entertainers of her generation. Their daily lives no longer overlapped the way they had during production, and the romantic dimension of what they had shared did not continue in the same form, but they stayed in contact. That fact alone says something important. Two people whose lives are moving fast and demanding careers, who have every practical reason to let a past connection quietly fade, chose instead to maintain it. They called each other, they sent messages. When significant things happened in each other's lives, they acknowledged them. This was not a formal arrangement or something either of them talked about publicly as a rule. It was simply something they did, consistently and quietly, because the connection between them was real enough to sustain itself without requiring any particular effort or occasion. One of the most well-known examples of how that bond expressed itself came in 1967 when Elvis married Priscilla. Ann-Margret did not attend the wedding, which was a small and private ceremony in Las Vegas, but Elvis made sure she knew about it before it became public. He did not want her to hear about it through the news or through someone else. He called her directly. That gesture was small in practical terms, but significant in what it said about how he regarded her. He respected her enough to treat her with consideration, even at a moment that was entirely about his life with someone else. Ann-Margret later said that the call meant a great deal to her, not because of what it implied about his feelings, but because of what it said about his character. Ann-Margret married Roger Smith in 1967, the same year as Elvis's wedding to Priscilla.
Roger Smith was an actor and later became Ann-Margret's manager, and their marriage was a long and devoted one that lasted until his death in 2017. Elvis acknowledged her marriage as well, and the two of them continued to stay in touch across the years, even as both of their lives became more settled in different directions. The friendship they maintained existed comfortably alongside their separate commitments, without tension or complication, because both of them understood what it was and what it was not. Throughout the late 1960s and into the 1970s, as Elvis's life became more complicated and the pressures around him increased, Ann-Margret remained someone he could reach out to without any of the dynamics that made other relationships difficult. She was not part of his professional organization. She had no stake in his business decisions. She was simply someone who knew him, liked him, and wished him well. In a life that had become increasingly crowded with people who wanted something from him, that kind of uncomplicated goodwill was genuinely valuable. When Elvis died on August 16, 1977, Ann-Margret was among those who responded with grief that was clearly personal. She sent a large floral arrangement to the funeral in the shape of a guitar, a gesture that was both public and deeply private at the same time. It was a way of saying goodbye that carried meaning without requiring explanation. People who understood the history between them understood what it meant. People who did not know the history could still see that it came from somewhere real. Ann-Margret has spoken about Elvis in the years since his death with a consistency that reflects how permanent a place he holds in her memory. She does not dramatize what they shared or turn it into a story larger than it was. She simply speaks about him with warmth, clarity, and respect, the way a person speaks about someone who genuinely mattered to them. What started in the quiet weeks before a film shoot in 1963 turned out to be one of the lasting connections of both their lives, and that is exactly what their own words and actions across more than a decade confirm.